The difference between the two sides is this. On one side, everything you built still matters. On the other side, none of it ever did. My name is Marcus Coleman. I'm 46 years old. I spent 18 years working in live entertainment as a sound engineer. Arenas, stadiums, major tours, the kind of shows where the crowd doesn't even know your name because the name that matters is the one on the ticket. I have been closer to fame than most people will ever get. I have eaten dinner in the same room as people whose faces were on billboards the size of buildings. And I can tell you, from where I stand now, from what I was shown on the other side of death, that there is not a single one of those faces that death recognized. If you're new here, subscribe before we go further. What I'm about to share is the kind of thing I have sat with for a long time before deciding to say out loud. I don't want you to miss the rest of it. And if any part of this connects with something you've been carrying, a question, an experience, something you saw that you couldn't explain, drop it in the comments. You'd be surprised how many people watching this right now feel exactly the same way and have never said it to a single person. I need to start with what happened to my body because you have to understand how close I came to not being here at all. I went into cardiac arrest at 44 years old. No prior heart condition, no warning signs. I was loading equipment into a venue in the middle of an afternoon in February, and somewhere between the loading dock and the stage, my heart simply stopped. A crew member found me on the floor about 4 minutes later. The paramedics were on scene within 7 minutes, and then they worked on me for a long time, a very long time. 7 resuscitation attempts. That's the number I was given later. 7 times they tried to bring me back. The doctor who spoke to my wife said he had never attempted that many before getting a return. He said if they'd stopped at 5, which is standard protocol, I would not have come back. There is a version of this story where I'm not here telling it. I feel that version every single day. I want you to understand that 7 is not a dramatic detail I'm adding for effect. 7 times. That number is the background of everything I'm about to tell you, because what I experienced on the other side happened in the space of those attempts, in the time between when my body stopped and when it was forced to start again. And the length of what I experienced, the depth of it, had absolutely no relationship to the minutes passing in that loading dock. Time on the other side does not work the way time works here. I was somewhere that didn't have minutes at all. The first thing I'm going to tell you is about the place itself, because if I don't establish that, what comes after won't make sense. People ask me what it felt like to cross over. I always struggle with the comparison. The closest I can get, and this is not a perfect comparison, nothing is this. Imagine the largest place you have ever physically stood inside. For me, that was a stadium. 90,000 people, open roof, the kind of building that makes a single human being feel like a dot. I've worked in stadiums. I know what it feels like to stand in one at 4 in the morning when it's empty and the lights are down and you can't see the ceiling and the sound of your own footsteps disappears before it comes back to you. That was the biggest space my body had ever occupied. The beyond was to that stadium what the stadium is to a pebble. And I say that knowing how absurd it sounds. I'm not using metaphor. I am trying to give you a unit of measure for something that doesn't have one. The place I entered had no walls my perception could locate. It had no ceiling. It had no floor in the conventional sense. It was simply present, in every direction, with a kind of depth that made the concept of distance feel like a word invented by people who had never been anywhere. And standing inside it, I was not afraid. I was small in a way that felt correct. The way you feel small standing at the edge of the ocean, and the smallness isn't a threat, it's just an accurate measurement. He was there. I'm not going to spend time explaining how I knew it was Jesus. I knew the way you know you're breathing, not through reasoning, through recognition of something that had always been true. And he didn't say anything at first. He showed me something. I want you to understand that what he showed me was not a punishment tour. It was not designed to terrify me into behavior. There was no theatrical element to it. It was more like being handed a document, more like standing in a room where a truth you had been partially aware of was suddenly completely visible. And I received it the way you receive something true, not with fear, but with the awful clarity of having no ability to look away. He showed me a boundary. There is a place on the other side where what you can access stops. I don't have architecture for it. There are no doors. There are no walls you could identify from the outside. But there is a point past which something in you knows, without anyone telling you, that you cannot go. Not because you would be stopped, because you would not be able to exist there. Like heat near a flame. There is a distance where you can stand and where you cannot stand, and the difference is not a rule, it is a reality. I stood at that boundary, and I felt it. The weight of what was on the other side of it pressed against me in a way I cannot explain through physics. It wasn't pain, exactly. It was the opposite of the presence I had just come from, where his presence was full the way a room full of oxygen is full, so full you don't notice it. What was on the other side of that boundary was empty in the same proportion, absence as a physical force, the absence of everything that makes existence worth experiencing. And then he showed me the people inside it. This is the part I have carried for 2 years. This is the part that changed the way I wake up in the morning and the way I think about everything I used to believe about success and recognition and the weight of a name. I recognized them, not because I was given a list, because I had spent 18 years in an industry built entirely on recognizing faces. And some of the faces I saw from where I stood at that boundary were faces I had set up lighting rigs for, faces I had checked audio levels for, faces I had watched perform to hundreds of thousands of people who treated their names like prayers. I won't tell you which faces. I made that decision the first week I was back, and it hasn't changed. Not because naming them would be wrong. What I saw, but because the moment I name a specific person, the conversation becomes about whether I'm lying about that specific person instead of about the truth they illustrate. And the truth they illustrate is bigger than any individual name. Here's what Jesus showed me about why they were there. And this is the thing I need you to sit with, because it is the answer to a question I think most people watching this have asked at some point. They were not there because they were bad people in the ordinary sense. Not all of them. Some of them were, by any conventional measurement, generous. Some of them were beloved. Some of them had foundations and causes and public commitments to doing good in the world. Some of them had fan bases that numbered in the tens of millions. People who had shaped their lives around the work, who wept at concerts, who named their children after them, who felt known and seen and understood by the music or the films or the performances. They were there because they had known there was something more real than all of that, and they had chosen the applause anyway. That's the line. And I need you to hear how precise that line is. This is not about what industry someone worked in. It's not about whether the content was clean or dark, political or apolitical, religious or secular. The line is this: at some point in each of their lives, something had broken through. Something true had gotten close enough to be heard. And in that moment, they had a choice: to let it in and let it change what they were building their life for, or to keep building what was already getting them recognition and treat the truth like a visitor who arrived at an inconvenient time. Most of them didn't slam the door on it violently. Most of them just didn't answer. They had people around them who would have told them that truth. I know that because I saw it. I saw the moments. I was shown the specific conversations, the old friend from before the fame, the letter that went unanswered, the night after the show when something inside them was cracked open by exhaustion or grief, and the real question surfaced for exactly long enough to be addressed, and they pushed it down because the schedule was full, and the tour was starting again, and there wasn't time for that kind of reckoning. Not yet, not until later. There was always going to be a later. Later never came for some of them, and I stood at that boundary and felt the weight of that, the weight of a later that never arrived. I want to tell you what he said to me about the fans, because this is the detail that I think is the hardest to sit with. The fans didn't save him. I know that seems obvious when I say it out loud. Of course, millions of followers don't constitute spiritual protection. Of course, adoration from strangers doesn't mean anything to eternity. We all know that intellectually. But there's a version of that knowledge we carry in our minds that is very different from the version I was shown from the other side. Because what I saw, and this is what Jesus showed me with complete clarity, was that some of them actually believed it would. Not as a theology, not as a doctrine they could have articulated, but as a felt reality. Somewhere underneath all the performance and the image management and the relentless maintenance of a public presence, there was a belief, quiet, rarely examined but present, that the love of that many people must mean something cosmic, that being needed by millions must confer some kind of protection, that the size of the audience was proof of some kind of divine approval. And I watched from the boundary the moment that belief met reality. The moment a soul that had been told by the world that it mattered above all others understood in an instant that the world's opinion had never been the measuring rod, that the only thing that had ever mattered was the thing they had access to and did not pursue. One of them, and I'll tell you this without the name because the name doesn't matter, one of them had given an interview about 20 years before they died. I was shown this, and in that interview, someone had asked them what they believed happened after death, and they had laughed. They had said they tried not to think about it. They had said, and these words were shown to me exactly, I figure if I've made enough people happy, someone up there has to be keeping score. Someone up there has to be keeping score. I stood at that boundary, and I understood for the first time what it cost to believe that. Not in a theoretical sense, in the sense of watching someone you recognize, someone whose voice I had adjusted levels on, whose face I had watched on stadium screens, standing at the end of everything they had built and discovering that the scoreboard they had imagined did not exist, that the currency they had spent their entire life accumulating was not accepted here. He told me, and this came as a weight, not a condemnation, because there was no cruelty in how it was delivered. He told me that fame had become a substitute god for more people than I could count. Not for everyone famous. That's important. Not everyone who is known by many is building their identity on the knowing. But for those I was shown, the ones at that boundary, the adoration of others had replaced the one thing they actually needed, not replaced it violently, gently, imperceptibly. The way a river reroutes itself around a stone over decades, until one day the original path is dry and nobody remembers it was ever the main channel. I stood there and I felt what I can only describe as grief. Deep, specific grief for each one, because he showed me what they had been before the audience existed. The person underneath the name, the one who had wanted something real before the real thing got crowded out by something louder. And then he showed me the other thing. And this is where everything I've just told you turns. He showed me the people in that crowd who had been listening. The ordinary ones. The ones without a platform, without a publicist, without a face anyone would recognize. People who had heard something real in the noise, not because of the famous person in many cases, but in spite of them. People who had used the song or the film or the performance as a starting point and then gone somewhere the performer never went. People who had heard something true in a piece of art and traced that truth back to its source, the source that the artist had walked away from. He said, and I am giving you the exact words as I received them, the harvest being celebrated now is not the one they planted. It is the one that grew through the cracks they left. I held that for a moment. I still hold it. There is a harvest. There is a real harvest, and it is being celebrated on the other side with a joy that makes the largest crowd I ever worked in feel like a quiet room. And a significant part of it came not from the famous people I was shown, but from the people who found truth in the cracks, in the missed opportunities, in the spaces the famous left unfilled, in the reaching of ordinary people who had no platform but also had no pretense. The harvest is real, the boundary is real, and the thing that determines which side of that boundary you land on has nothing to do with how many people know your name. He told me to go back. I felt it more than heard it. The sense of being returned, of the boundary becoming relevant to me personally, of the presence I had been standing in beginning to recede, not because it was leaving, but because I was. And in the last moment before I felt the pull back into my body, I asked, not in words, but in the way you communicate in that place, which is more like thought made real than speech. I asked if there was one thing to carry back. The answer was not what I expected. It wasn't a doctrine. It wasn't an instruction. It was a question. He sent me back with a question, not an answer. And that question has been the thing I have measured every day against since I came back. The question was, what are you building and for what? That's it. What are you building and for what? Simple enough to say in 5 words. Dense enough to spend a lifetime inside. I came back with 7 resuscitation attempts behind me and that question in front of me, and I have been trying to answer it honestly ever since. The doctors were surprised I could form sentences. I was surprised to care about sentences at all. The things that had seemed important before I went under, the next contract, the reputation in the industry, whether a certain producer would remember my name, those things had the weight of paper when I came back. Not because they were bad things, just because they were the wrong size for what I now knew I was actually carrying. It took me 8 months to talk about this to anyone outside my family. Not because I was afraid of not being believed, though I was, but because I spent 8 months trying to find words adequate to what I had seen, and I still don't have them. What I have is the best approximation available in a language that was built for a world that is smaller than the one I briefly visited. I want to say something to you directly before I finish. If you have built something, a career, a following, a reputation, a brand, and that thing has become the thing you reach for when you feel unsteady, this is not a condemnation. I understand the reaching. I understand what it means to have people know your name and to feel in that knowing like you exist more completely. I spent 18 years in rooms where the whole architecture was built around that feeling. I get it, but I am telling you, from the other side of 7 resuscitation attempts, from standing at a boundary where none of the names I had ever set audio levels for could make any difference to anything, that feeling is not the thing you are actually hungry for. It is the closest your current circumstances have offered to the thing you are actually hungry for. And there is a difference between those two things that only becomes visible at the place where everything else runs out. I am not famous. I don't have a foundation with my name on it. I have never had my face on a billboard. I went into cardiac arrest loading equipment for someone who did. And I came back with something none of them were shown. Not because I was better, I was not, but because I came back at all. And what I was shown demands to be said out loud. So here's the question I was sent back with, the one he gave me to carry, not as an instruction, but as a thing to sit with. What are you building? And for what? Don't answer it quickly. Don't answer it for me in the comments with the answer you think is correct. Sit with it before you do anything else today. Let it live in you the way it has lived in me. Because the honest answer, the one that lives underneath the comfortable answer, is the one that matters. If this reached you today, if it moved something that needed moving, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment, not to perform reaction, not because it helps the algorithm, but because I read every one. And I believe, based on what I saw, that this conversation is part of the harvest. The ordinary, unsponsored, unfamous harvest that grows through the cracks. And subscribe if you're not already here. I'm going to keep saying what I was sent back to say for as long as I have a voice and a breath to say it with. The boundary is real. The harvest is real. And 7 attempts later, I am here to tell you both.